All right, in this video, I want to spend some time talking about Brad Hooker's objective list theory. Objective list theory is a theory about the nature of the good life. It's a theory about what is necessary for human well-being and flourishing. And so here we're engaged in the value theory question of what constitutes the good life. And we can pose this question a number of different ways in order to integrate different philosophical concepts and to look at the question from different angles. So we can ask, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for well-being? So what are the things we must have in order to have well-being? And then we can also ask, what are the intrinsic goods of life? What are those things which are fundamentally valuable? All right, so a necessary condition is something which must occur for an additional thing to occur. So we can ask, what are the necessary conditions for well-being? What are those things we must have in order to be well off? A sufficient condition is something which immediately brings about some additional thing. So we can ask, are there any things which are so important and valuable such that they suffice for well-being? For example, is having significant or important achievements so important that we can imagine a person being well off or flourishing just by having that aspect of life satisfied? If so, then that would be a sufficient condition for well-being. All right, and then we have the distinction between intrinsic and instrumental value. So when we value something instrumentally, we just care about it because it gets us something more fundamentally valuable. So when we care about something instrumentally, we care about it as a means to an end. So we care about money, for example, as a means to an end in the sense that we care about it for its role in getting us things which are more fundamentally valuable. For example, things like pleasure and freedom. If money didn't get us things like pleasure and freedom, then we wouldn't care about it. It would just be, I don't know, a physical object. To contrast, when we value something intrinsically, we value it for its own sake and not for what it gets us. So, for example, Mill argues that pleasure is intrinsically valuable, which is to say we care about it for its own sake. We don't point to other goods or aspects of life to explain the value of pleasure. Rather, when we explain the value of other things, we point to their role in bringing about pleasure for us. So money is instrumentally valuable because it brings about the more fundamental or intrinsically valuable good we call pleasure. All right, so in the elements of well-being, Brad Hooker is going to provide us an account of a particular version of objective list theory. So in order to understand objective list theory, we first need to understand the distinction between objectivity and subjectivity. So when something is objectively true, we say that it's a fact, and therefore that it's attitude independent. So water freezes at 32 degrees is a fact, and it's attitude independent because our attitude towards it can't change it or influence it. Things that are subjective are attitude dependent because they're a matter of taste or opinion. So the guacamole is delicious seems to be subjective because whether you take it to be true or false will depend on your attitude. People disagree about the deliciousness of guacamole, and there doesn't seem to be some final fact of the matter. So in the debate about the nature of the good life, some views are objective and some views are subjective. Objective list theory will be an objective view. It holds that there are objective facts about well-being. And so it can be contrasted with any theory which views well-being as a purely subjective affair. So if a view about the nature of good life is objective, then it holds that there are some attitude-independent truths about the nature of well-being. So there are some things we must have in order to be well off. And the things are attitude-independent in the sense that it doesn't matter what we think about them. So just to give an example, it seems like the human body needs water in order to function. And that's an attitude-independent fact about the human body, in the sense that supposing someone became convinced that they didn't need water, this would not impact or influence the body's need for water. They may very well believe fully that their body doesn't need water, and this wouldn't change the objective fact that indeed their body does need water because it's an attitude-independent fact about the body's needs. So objective list theorists think there are attitude-independent facts about human flourishing at the psychological level. There are some things we need to have in order to be well off, and we need to have them even if we don't actually believe we need them or endorse our need for them. So this can be contrasted with any subjective theory, and one major subjective theory is called desire preference theory. And this view holds that well-being is obtained by having one's desires or preferences satisfied. And since desires and preferences are subjective states, this view holds that well-being is merely subjective. So according to desire preference theory, we get well-being just by having what we want, whatever that is, just by having our preferences satisfied. Objective list theory, by contrast, thinks there are facts about well-being, so we might be misled about what's good for us. Some of our preferences or desires may be things we endorse, but they might not actually get us well-being because they don't cohere with the facts about human wellness. So Hooker argues there is a set of intrinsic goods, each of which is necessary for well-being. So there's a list of goods, each of which is intrinsic, each of which is valuable for its own sake. So these goods are not instrumentally valuable, they're intrinsically valuable, which is to say they're fundamentally valuable. So there's a list of goods, each of which is necessary for well-being. In other words, if you're going to be well off, you need to achieve the entire list. So he says, according to objective list theory, a life contains more welfare to the extent that it contains pleasure, knowledge of important matters, friendship, significant achievement, and autonomy. Which is to say, pleasure, knowledge of important matters, friendship, significant achievement, and autonomy are all necessary for well-being, and they all matter for their own sake. So contrast this right away with Mill's view. Mill thinks pleasure is the only intrinsic good. So everything else on the list would be merely instrumental for Mill. For Mill, we care about knowledge of important matters because they enhance the pleasure that we experience in our lives. Hooker thinks that although pleasure is intrinsically valuable, other things are also intrinsically valuable. So there's a complex set of intrinsic goods, each of which will be necessary for well-being. One basic way of viewing objective list theory is to say that it views well-being as significantly more complex. And I think this might count in favor of the view. So one implication of the fact that there is a list of necessary conditions for well-being is that not one of the items on the list will suffice for well-being. So for example, having many friendships won't be enough for human flourishing. So again, contrast this with Mill. Mill says, pleasure is the only intrinsic good, so although it's necessary, it also suffices. It's jointly necessary and sufficient. Objective list theory says it's more complicated. Not one of these things will suffice, which means that having well-being might be more challenging because we have to balance a competing list of goods. So for example, someone who is striving for significant achievements might fail to have a sufficient quantity of friendships. A person who is trying to have a lot of significant achievements might not have enough pleasure. That's why well-being may be challenging to achieve, because it requires us to balance or strive for a variety of goods which are sometimes in conflict with one another. So the list is a set of necessary conditions, and we need to fully embrace the claim that there is objectivity about human flourishing. So Hooker's contention is that there are attitude-independent facts about well-being. So think about the implication of this. The implication is that these goods contribute to our well-being, even if we don't want them or care about them. So this is going to provide that crucial contrast between objective list theory and desire preference theory. Desire preference theory says something can only be good for you if you like it or want it or care about it. And it's this view that objective list theory denies. Objective list theory says, for example, that having friendships will enhance your well-being even if you don't want to have friendships. So on this view, you can be mistaken about what's good for you. Someone might want to be reclusive. They might not want to be social. And the objective list theorist will say they're missing some important fact about their wellness, and this might explain why they're unhappy. This might be a controversial aspect of the view because it says we're all roughly the same. We all need the same set of things. And we get asked, does that really cohere with the facts? All right, finally, I want to talk about Hooker's methodology, his strategy for establishing which goods are on the list. So in order to establish the list, he creates this thought experiment. So he uses significant achievement as well as pleasure and the other goods as examples in order to illustrate this thought experiment. So he says, we imagine two lives for someone that are as much alike as possible, except that one of these lives contains a larger amount of significant achievement than the other. We are trying to hold everything equal as much as possible, with the single variable being the amount of significant achievement in the two possible lives. So here we want to isolate out other possible contributors to a person's well-being. So here he's like saying, let's use the scientific method and isolate out confounding variables. We then think about whether the life containing the larger amount of significant achievement would be more beneficial to the person living it than the life that contains a smaller amount of significant achievement, but is otherwise as similar as possible. If the correct answer is no, then significant achievement is not an element of well-being. However, the correct answer seems to be that the life with a larger amount of significant achievement is more beneficial to the person who leads that life than the life that contains a smaller amount of significant achievement but is otherwise as similar as possible. Okay, so Hooker's going to establish which goods are on the list through this thought experiment. Imagine two lives as similar as possible. Now give one of those lives a possible good on the list. So for example, imagine two lives as similar as possible, but one life contains more pleasure. If we think that the life with more pleasure entails a higher level of well-being for the individual living it, then it seems that pleasure is a necessary element of well-being. It contributes to their well-being. But if we don't think the life with more pleasure is a better life, is a life with more well-being, then well-being ought not to be on the list, and therefore well-being is not an intrinsic good which is necessary for human well-being and flourishing. So this is the method by which Hooker establishes whether a good ought to be on the list. So this is how he establishes how pleasure, significant achievements, relationships, knowledge of important matters, and autonomy are all important for human well-being. They're all necessary for human well-being in the sense that we must obtain them in order to be well off. And that's because they're all intrinsically valuable. They're all valuable for their own sake, independent of what they get us. And then finally, there are a set of objective facts about human well-being or flourishing. It's a fact that human beings need freedom in order to be well off. And it's a fact in the sense that it's attitude independent, which is to say, it's true even if you don't believe it or care about it. And so an important implication of Hooker's view is that we can be wrong about what's good for us. A person might not think that freedom is important to them, perhaps because they live in an oppressive society and they've never experienced freedom. But even though they don't think freedom will be good for them, there's a fact about the goodness of freedom. And when they do finally achieve freedom, they will be well off, even though they didn't think they would be.